Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we attack shame wherever we can, especially in the sexual department. So that's a big part of what we're doing here. We also want to just give you a lot of information and education on how to have better sexual lives, better mental health lives, and better spiritual lives. So that's what we're about here. Today, I couldn't be more thrilled because I have, I think, a really important person on the show. His name is Dr. Ian Kerner. He has written several books. One that a lot of people may have heard of is She Comes First. And that was a great book in helping really this issue of the orgasm gap, kind of, especially with heterosexual couples, kind of think about that. But the most recent book he wrote is So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex. And I will just say that I have found this to be a pretty significant game changer in what's available for people having relational sex out in the kind of in all the different books. And I really found it very useful. So, and it came out in 2021. So I wanted to talk to him about it. Dr. Kerner is the co-director of the sex therapy program at the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy. He contributes regularly on the topic of sexual health for CNN. He is the New York Times bestselling author of She Comes First. And that has been translated into more than a dozen languages. And he maintains a private practice in New York City. So dedicated to honoring the centrality of sexuality in his patients' lives. So welcome to the show, Dr. Kerner.
Thank you, Natasha, and call me Ian, please.
Okay, I will do going forward. More intimate. Well, what would you like to add to just, I always invite people to share a little bit about kind of their personal histories, how they came to be a sex therapist, what interest brought them to these topics to begin with. So anything else you want to add about kind of your bio, we would love to hear from you.
I would say, like a lot of people in the field, and I'd love to hear more about your story, but from what I gleaned, you fall into the category of sex therapists, who are also very passionate about topics and can be advocates of topics or evangelists of topics. It's no mistake that if you look through history, a lot of sex therapists have also been on the front lines of really trying to change sexuality politically in our country and whatnot. For me, growing up, I struggled with sexuality and sexual problems, and I really felt like I couldn't get what was the sex that I wanted to have in my head matched up with my body, and really led to a lot of depression. I really just felt like I wasn't good at sex and couldn't last during sex. And so I started to research sort of while I was in college. I did a secret major in sort of the history of, I think, sexology to try and just figure it all out. I think that's ultimately what led me to become a sex therapist, is trying to solve my own problems. And in She Comes First and in other books, I've been candid about my own struggles and my own celebrations of sexuality. And it's something that I think brings people into my practice, and I don't know, I'm still very authentically involved with trying to help people solve their sexual problems, because I believe that sexuality is such an important part of being alive and just gets so neglected.
I would totally agree with that. I think that I would totally agree that I think as sex therapists and all the sex therapists I know and have talked to, it's intertwined with our own personal stories. So I come from kind of a religiously conservative space myself. I was raised in the Latter-day Saint Mormon tradition. And so a lot of your messaging around sexual shame and sexual scripts really kind of resonated with me, and the work that I do with so many people who are either becoming more progressive within their faith traditions and want to kind of really look at how sexuality has been maybe impeded by some of that, but also a lot of people who are deconverting from religion and also are wanting to explore sexuality in ways that they felt that they never had permission for. So that really resonated with, I think, what you had as your primary theme throughout your book was this idea of sexual scripts. And calling it the sex script, analyzing that. So I'd like to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about what you mean by that, and how people can start thinking about what might go into a sexual script.
Sure. So that book, So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex, really comes directly out of my practice and the way I work. And it's a question that I frequently ask couples in the first session after learning more about the problems that they may be experiencing. And those problems could be desire discrepancy issues, low libido, mismatched libido. It could be a sexual function issue like early ejaculation or erectile unpredictability in men, or sexual pain or orgasm issues in women. It could be a difference in erotic temperaments and erotic personalities that just sort of leads to incompatibility. And like many sex therapists, I try and look at a problem through many different lenses, what we would call sort of a biopsychosocial sort of relational perspective, just meaning that sexuality is determined by so many different factors, from lifestyle and health to cultural issues and our own inner psychologies, and of course the relationships we build and the extent to which they provide a foundation to have sex. So once I've learned a lot about the problem, I will often ask, so tell me about the last time you had sex. And I'm very interested in hearing about a sexual event from start to finish, because I think it tells such a rich story. Certainly at one level, at an event level, in terms of who initiated the sex, when and where did it happen, how did it get going, how did this couple build arousal, was it with their bodies, with their minds, were they able to get really absorbed and create mutual pleasure together, did that pleasure result in orgasms for one or both partners? Was there an afterglow to the sex where they lingered with each other, or did they just sort of get up and get on their iPhones? And most importantly, or I shouldn't say most importantly, but is there an erotic thread or a connection between the sexual events? What's the connecting tissue from one sexual event to another? And it's interesting, you hear about a sexual event at that level, and certainly you can understand, well, oh, this is where a sexual problem is starting to manifest during a sexual event. So I sort of call that whole event and laying it out a sex script. And it really becomes a microcosm of a couple's sex life. There's so much rich material contained in there. And many of us, I think most of us, do often default to what I would call a sex script, a way of being together. If it works, it can be fantastic. It can be like a beautiful choreography, a dance that we always know how to dance, that we can lose ourselves in, that we can improvise within, that we can just sort of go and be fully present in. And if a sex script doesn't work, it's often this repetitive experience of not feeling connected, and that's where we can lie in bed next to someone and just feel a million miles apart. So I feel like we can take a sex script, we can sort of deconstruct it, and then we can edit it and we can rewrite it. And so again, couples are coming in to see us mainly because they're trying to overcome problems. And so the problem is often very much embedded in the sex script itself. Does that make sense as a sort of a cursory explanation?
Absolutely. I don't know if this is a good time to talk a little bit too about, you mentioned kind of our sexuality from this metaphor of like a house, and that we stay a lot of times on the main floor versus the basement, and I think a lot of times when people are coming in and talking to us about sexual issues, they kind of stay on main floor issues, like well, I didn't have an orgasm, or he didn't get an erection, or she, didn't seem to initiate. And so they kind of describe these things. But can you explain a little bit about what you mean by
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you brought that up because I use the metaphor of a house to sort of describe, very often how we live our lives, and very much we spend a lot of time on the main floor of life, right? We are waking up, we're, in my case, taking care of kids and making lunches and getting them off to school and going to work and seeing clients and dealing with taxes and other people and teaching and coming home and chores and maybe getting to have sex and maybe not getting to have sex and going to sleep. And I feel like we wake up and once again we're on the main floor of life, and that's where we live most of the time. That's where we sometimes bump up against each other and get in conflicts. And I think there's also what I call the basement, which I think of as the emotional underground. It's much quieter. We can hear the footsteps and all the running around upstairs, but it's down in that emotional basement, in that emotional underground, where we keep some of our primary emotions. We might keep our feelings of neglect and fear and loneliness. I mean, maybe up on the main floor, that's getting expressed through conflict or through yelling or avoidance or who knows what. So I think we keep our vulnerabilities down in the basement. I think we keep our histories down in the basement, just like we would really have boxes of stuff that we put down there marked 1992 and 1997. I think we put our histories, I think we put our traumas, I think we put our memories down there. And I think a sexual script always contains, I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's not just happening at an event level, it's also what's happening in the emotional underground. And certainly for people who are dealing with shame, who are dealing with trauma, who have grown up in sex negative cultures or sex avoidant cultures, certainly what's happening down in the basement is really bubbling up and affecting what's happening on the main floor. And I think you see that in a sex script. You see the extent to which people are connected or disconnected, the extent to which they're really being authentically embodying themselves and participating or not, the way in which they are relating to the cultural sex scripts that dominate us, and the extent to which they feel shame.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
So a sex script is a wonderful lens into both the main floor and into the basement.
Yeah, no, I really loved that. You have a lot of really good case examples too, where you kind of point out how this can show up kind of in real time for a lot of people. And I think what really came out of that for me is this reminder that I've seen so often, that a partner can really be an ally to so much of that healing that we need to do, right? I mean, we spend the first 18 to 25 years of life, kind of being raised by other people, and we have a lot of things that happen. And then I feel like, especially if you, partner, like many people do monogamously from their 20s on, now you have 50 years with somebody where you're going to be able to really focus on how those first 20 to 25 years got kind of messed up for a lot of us. So, and to really see a partner as an ally in that work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all bring our histories and our childhoods and our traumas, whether they're capital T or lowercase t. And as therapists, we can do a lot of work excavating the past, but the most healing aspect is something that really we can't do in therapy, which is to really interpersonally and deeply and intersubjectively connect with another person and have reparative experiences of whatever losses we're having. If we, I grew up an only child, and no fault of my mother, but I was a single mom, only child, and I was a latchkey kid, and I spent a lot of time in front of the TV by myself, and I think I had internalized a sense of loneliness and neglect, which I've become aware of, but my relationship with my wife, who's so affectionate and comes from such a big family and is so loving and adoring, has just filled that hole and filled that gap. And so I think that sex is also can be such a big, beautiful boost of reparative connection for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think that people oftentimes look at sex as a trauma healer. And I think that's a beautiful invitation that part of your book anyway focused on. But yeah. Oh, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say I could dig in a little bit, but there are plenty of stories in there where people have healed their trauma through sexuality and have felt finally connected, finally seen, finally felt.
Yeah, right. And I think sex more than anything can have the capacity for both of those things, to be unseen and to be seen, right? And I think the vulnerability of that as well, to show yourself or to hide yourself. Yeah. And that's the interweaving of the constant dance. So with all of that in mind, maybe, and I just recommend everybody read the book because there's no way we're going to get into everything in this in this interview. But what would you say are kind of like some of the more classic things that get in the way of sexual scripts, or how are people scripting their sexuality in ways that you have not found super helpful?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I work with a lot of heterosexual couples, and I work with a lot of gay couples, and I will say particularly gay male couples, although I work with some lesbian couples as well. And with heterosexual couples, I feel that they are sort of overshadowed by what I call the intercourse discourse, that intercourse is really the primary way to have sex, and anything that comes before intercourse is really just an optional sort of appetizer compared to sort of the main entree of intercourse. And so many of my patients get to intercourse very quickly. Sometimes that's the first thing they do with relatively little to no warm up, or they spend 2 or 3 minutes, or they're not really spending time above the neck, or they're not really spending time above the waist. And we can talk more about what it means to be above the neck. But the point is that they're getting to intercourse, and intercourse is not fulfilling the job of helping them to become aroused and absorbed. To me, great sex is becoming absorbed, mutually self-absorbed, where you're just totally present in a way in which the outside world and your thinking mind is completely tuned out. And as we all know in terms of the orgasm gap, and how especially for heterosexual couples, a lot of women do not find that intercourse on its own is adequate enough to really create that state of absorption. A lot of couples have flawed sex scripts in their rush to intercourse. And, speaking of the gay couples or the LGBTQ couples I work with, there was an interesting study of the last sexual event of, I want to say, I might get it wrong, it's in my book, but let's just say like 25,000 gay and bisexual men reported on the last time they had sex, what a sexual event consisted of, and only 35% of them ended up having intercourse. The other 65% were engaged in what we call outer course, or activities that we would consider to be foreplay, that I consider to be core play. And they put these different activities, I think there were only 10 or 12 basic activities: kissing, oral sex, manual stimulation, but they pulled them together into thousands of different combinations. And so I think that heterosexual sex scripts often just consist mainly of the behavior of intercourse, which overshadows other behaviors. And I think we should just sort of take a much more open-ended approach to a sex script, and not privilege or prioritize any one behavior over the other, but think of them all as sort of like a tasting menu to just take from.
Yeah, I love that so much. And you offer so much education about just the realities of, I think it's only about 25% of people who identify as women will have orgasms through intercourse alone. That's something that's come into my office incessantly throughout the years. It's just, teach me how to have a real orgasm. And I'm like, what do you mean by a real orgasm? And it usually means through intercourse. And I'm like, that's an interesting idea that's a real orgasm.
It's funny. I used to work with so many couples in which the female partners were frustrated by the lack of orgasm during intercourse. And now I meet so many couples in which female partners are resigned to not having orgasms during intercourse and don't expect that from partnered intercourse. And will sort of say, well, an orgasm is for when I'm with myself, and partnered sex is about something else. And look, I like that partnered sex can be more than just orgasm, and it should be more than just orgasm. It should be everything. But orgasm is a wonderful culmination of that process of absorption that I described, that I think represents just a total letting go and total surrender and total moment of mutual pleasure that I think everyone deserves out of their sex scripts.
Yeah, for sure. What would you say are the basic elements then of a sex script? Let's go through kind of what your ideas are about how can people conceptualize? Because I know you talked a lot about beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah. So you mean just walk through sort of the structure of a sex script in that way in broad strokes?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first part of a sex script is sort of about the call to action or getting going. For some of us, that comes in the form of desire and a feeling of really wanting. For some of us, it's more of a reason, or we have to have a willingness or a motivation. It's something that, we might not feel in our bodies at that moment, but we know that if we get going and we start to put ourselves through the motions, hopefully it's going to feel really good. So I think the first phase of a sex script, I guess, is what we could call the desire phase. And I think for many couples, partners are in sort of clashing desire frameworks, or they're in different desire frameworks. And so it's a question of sort of getting into a shared desire framework. And I think the biggest issue, is it okay that I'm using heterosexual couples as a reference point?
Yeah, that's fine. Absolutely. Yeah.
We
have a lot of folks who listen.
Yeah, no, it's just sometimes illustrates the starkest differences in sometimes in sex scripts. But I think many men fall into what we would call a spontaneous desire model. I call it a reactive desire model sometimes, because men can react so quickly to visual cues or to any kind of sexual cue. It could be a visual cue, it could be a memory, it could be smell, it could be certainly touch, but those cues metabolize so quickly into arousal that there's no difference between desire and arousal. They almost feel like one and the same. And I think that's why sometimes so many partners of men, so many women, can be perplexed by just sort of like the way a guy can pivot from just helping a kid with homework to, oh, here's an opportunity, bang, let's go into sex. I mean, I think men can really experience that spontaneous desire. And I think women tend to fall into a more responsive desire framework. And this may be something that you've covered a lot in your podcast, Natasha, so I won't dwell on. But, for many women, it's harder to turn off the stressors and everything that's happening in the environment, and harder to just sort of tune into desire. And there needs to be either a percolation and kind of a simmering of sexual cues. Those stressors have to come down, and there has to be sort of a warming up and a simmering. So these two desire frameworks frequently clash. So I think the key to this first phase, especially if libidos are mismatched, is really the commitment, the willingness to simmer and percolate, whatever that looks like. And that kind of brings me into the next phase, which is starting to build arousal. once we have the desire and we're getting going with the sex script, how do we really cultivate the arousal so that we can start to become absorbed? I think, as I mentioned, I think some couples will go straight to intercourse and maybe not get much of that arousal at all. Many couples in their sex scripts will go very quickly to genital-based activities, whether it's oral sex or manual stimulation, and those can be great activities, but without starting to sort of simmer and build that base of arousal, a couple may not be absorbed enough in the sex script to really appreciate those activities. So we really need to begin above the neck, I think, with psychological arousal. There are women who can basically fantasize their way to orgasm during masturbation without actually touching themselves. I know from both firsthand experience as well as working with a lot of men that it doesn't take much visual stimuli or sexual stimuli to start to get an erection, So basically the point I'm making is that our brains really are very powerful, and that psychological stimuli really converts into physiological arousal. And it's usually when we're with ourselves and our sexuality that we tend to stimulate our minds and our imaginations, whether it's fantasizing or remembering something really sexy from the past, or reading some erotica, or listening to something, or watching some visual material, hopefully in the form of ethical porn if we like porn. But that psychological arousal is really lacking. So many sex scripts are really sort of just dehydrated of psychological arousal. So in the book I talk about a lot of ways to cultivate psychological arousal, and it's not as simple as just hey, what's your fantasy? Let's act out your fantasy. Tell me about your fantasy. No, it's really about nurturing the erotic imaginations, our erotic imaginations, in an emotionally safe environment where we're not going to feel any shame. So hopefully in these early stages of arousal, we're cultivating psychological arousal. Hopefully we're also cultivating sensual arousal through touch, through kissing. I think kissing is such a wonderful way to sort of get synchronized. And so many couples I work with, they don't kiss much, or they don't use kissing meditatively, right? Sex is ultimately, it's a kind of meditation. We really want to lose ourselves in it. We really want to pay attention to the sensations. So I think there's a lot of above the neck and just a lot of above the waist touch that can also happen. And then I think, hopefully we have really launched our sex script and we really cultivated some desire and arousal, and we have those feelings in our genitals where we want more, and we organically want more, and we're, as partners, we're synchronized. And then I think that's where we would introduce more outer course activities. That's where we would introduce more manual stimulation of the genitals, oral stimulation of the genitals, using sex toys, transitioning into an intercourse if that's something that's really important to us. But at that point, what we really want is, for our thinking brains to have really deactivated and to really have turned off. And there's a concept that's called entrainment, when we are really in sync. You'll sometimes see birds flying and they're all just perfectly in sync, or you'll hear a band playing and they're just improvising and they're just totally in harmony with each other. You'll see this with dancers, or you'll see it with a father pushing a child on a swing, or two people throwing a ball back and forth. Sometimes it can even happen like washing the dishes. We just lose ourselves. We become entrained. And that's what we want to happen also in our sex scripts. We want to deepen and we want to become entrained. And then, of course, we also want to be able to understand how to give each other orgasms, how to give and receive orgasms. And so those are sort of, I think, some of the fundamental building blocks of a sex script. I think the what I call the aftercare period. It's not what I call it. It's a term that comes from the BDSM community, because those BDSM scenes often involve really understanding how are we going to care for each other when the scene is done. And I think that all couples should think about that period following sex and how to care for each other and linger, especially in the afterglow of pleasure. That's part of the sex script. And then, as I said earlier, the erotic thread is also part of a sex script. What connects two sexual events? Are we supposed to just show up after working on our taxes and say, let's go have sex? What happens to our erotic selves when we're not having sex? And so we need, whether it's through touch and playfulness and flirtation, maintaining that erotic thread and letting our sexual selves up on the main floor of life, into some of the action of our days. So I think those are kind of the building blocks of a sex script, and that's what I review in the book, is sort of how to focus on each of those phases.
Yeah, and I love that. And I think it's really what I talk to so many couples about, which is where you started, is one of the myths, right? Is that sex is intercourse. And it's like, no, sex is all of this, right? It's the initiation, it's the playfulness, it's the getting into different arousal levels, right? Depending on where you're at, it's the afterglow time. All of it encompasses the sex. And I love how you said core play instead of foreplay, because I use outer course a lot. I think yours is the first time I'm hearing core play, which I love that, because foreplay, that kind of insinuates that we're doing something before the real act, whereas all of it is real and all of it is wonderful. And like you're mentioning, our gay and lesbian couples are really showing that it's not intercourse focused that makes it really amazing.
And I think this is an example of where a cultural sex script really affects our personal sex script. The cultural sex script is that intercourse is real sex, or intercourse is that extension of procreative into, relational sex. And I think we sometimes really suffer under that sex script. I mean, certainly I deal with so many men, so many young men in college in their 20s who are running into such erection problems because they have so much anxiety around intercourse. And I meet so many women who are still faking orgasms and performing their way through sex, or having painful sex because they're not properly aroused. Again, all because of this cultural script around intercourse.
Yeah, right. And I think with most of my audience, that we tend to come from these conservative religious scripts and a lot of gender scripts, right, about what women are supposed to be doing and men supposed to be doing, especially in the initiation type stuff, right? Like women are kind of under this script of like, well, I will be maybe awakened by a man, and I will, be a good, dutiful wife, and therefore I'll offer sex from that perspective. Like, these are scripts that are not super helpful. And then, men have their own, like, I'm supposed to be this nice guy, but I'm also supposed to be the aggressor, and just so much stuff that people are dealing with.
We're not supposed to be having sex at all with each other for some reason. You're right. There's just so many scripts that constrain and govern how we're supposed to operate in our bodies. I know you work with a lot of people who grew up in sex negative cultures and are trying to become more sex positive. I work with a lot of couples here in New York who grew up in sex avoidant homes.
Can you really quickly go through, because you explained those in the book? So you had like sex negative, sex avoidant. You had a few others. Do you mind?
No, I think the main ones were really just, sex negative, sex avoidant, and sex positive is just sort of, and I think we're all trying to, move towards sex positivity and whatever that looks like for us in our individual lives. And I think, as we've really been discussing, so many of us just grew up with internalized ideas and scripts around sex that really cultivate shame or lack of connection. And then there are people like me who grew up in cultures where sex just wasn't talked about at all. It wasn't necessarily talked about in a positive way or in a negative way, but there was just a gap in education and a gap in learning. And and that's where some of those more dangerous shame-inducing sex scripts can really become internalized. And I think it's about sex avoidance, sex negativity, trying to get to sex positivity.
Yeah, I think the other category you mentioned was just where sexuality happens inappropriately in the home, like sexual trauma. And so then you have an added kind of component of that. And Trini says on our post, she's like, I faked for the longest time because of my religious family and upbringing, as far as, what you're supposed to be doing sexually versus what you're actually surrendering to. So one of the things I'd like to have you maybe go into a little bit, more deep, if you wouldn't mind, is this sense of like, I so resonate with what you were talking about, psychological arousal versus physiological arousal, and how so many people are like, oh, if I'm going to arouse you, I've got to touch you in a certain way. And like you're saying, oftentimes that's going straight to the erogenous zones. And I usually tell my partners, like, if I'm not at a 7, you are not touching my nipple. Right? Like, so you're going to have to get, we're going to have to do a lot of other things before we go to that erogenous zone. Right. And so, but people really struggle, I think, with the brain being their primary sex organ. There's a lot of scripts around that. Like, you only can be thinking about me or not thinking about anybody else, or the role of fantasy. And, if you're thinking about an orgy or something like that, that means that I'm not the central part of your life. Like,
yeah,
kind of see where I'm going as far as all the things that people feel and think when they're really allowing themselves to be erotically minded.
Yeah, well, I think learning how to communicate in ways that are psychologically arousing is really important. I mean, I think it's just important to be able to communicate about sex first and foremost, and to be able to talk about what we like, what we don't like, what's working, what's not working, to be able to give real-time feedback during sex. But then I think there's more, how do we activate our erotic minds? And I like to say that there's face-to-face psychological arousal and side-by-side psychological arousal. And face-to-face is that ability to maybe generate a fantasy together, or share a sexy memory together, role play something together, to really step into to step into our sort of erotic lives. And, I think most of us aren't really that prepared to do that. I think when we hear a partner say, well, what's your fantasy, or what's your turn on, it almost feels aggressive or confrontational. My turn on is having sex with you, and I'm turned on by your body. I don't have some secret trapdoor of kinky fantasies. We've been together for 20 years. I met you when you were my second lover. Like, what am I supposed to have back there that you haven't been exposed to? And yet, we're drawn to erotic material. We're drawn to erotic scenes in TV. And so I think a lot of couples, rather than trying to be face-to-face so quickly, can start side by side. So I'm a big advocate of reading erotica aloud together. There's so many amazing erotic audio podcasts. I'm a big fan of ethical porn, which is made with, full consent, and the actors are getting remunerated, and they have input into the scripts, and they want to be there. So I'm a big fan of getting our minds psychologically aroused. And then there's another dimension that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is just how we're allowing ourselves to feel during sex. I think good sex is sort of like consuming food in a way. I always tell my wife, like, yes, I love you. You're my person. You're my partner in life. But when it comes to sex, like, you're kind of like my food, like at that point, like you're kind of like my meal, and I want to dig in. And I go out a lot to restaurants in New York, and when you hear people sitting at tables, the way they're talking about their food, like, oh, this is so delicious, try this, they're moaning, they're taking it all in, like, and yet when it comes to sex, we can be very quiet and very shut down and very constrained. So why can't we experience the sex the way we do allow ourselves to experience food? So I think that that's also another way in which we communicate.
Yeah. So side by side, it sounds like you're saying have people like listen to things, watch things, be not necessarily looking at each other, and then maybe have a discussion about what they found arousing and what they're enjoying and all those things. Whereas face to face, you're saying we're actually
Yeah, we're more like two actors who are really getting into a scene, potentially. So that's kind of the difference between side by side and face to face. And, you mentioned something too that's interesting just about, people and their relationships with their own fantasies and their own erotic minds. I think people sometimes feel guilty when they have fantasies that don't include their partners, or we feel threatened by our partner's fantasies. I really think it's important to draw a distinct line between fantasy and reality. Now, some people would say, oh, the reality of, let's say, a threesome is so much greater than the fantasy of a threesome. I actually don't think that's true. I think that that's now becomes logistical, and that becomes real world, and that becomes complex in relational ways. I'm not trying to take away from all different kinds of sex, but I would not diminish the arousal that we can create with our imaginations. And, I can't tell you how many women, for example, I meet who can really get off on the fantasy of their partner having sex with someone else, and men, for that matter, going into like cuckolding fantasies. They actually wouldn't want to do it in life, or it wouldn't work out well in life, or they've tried it in life and it hasn't worked out well. And it's too bad that we let that sort of main floor kind of take precedence over, I guess, what I would call the emotional underground, the underground of our erotic minds.
Yeah. Meaning the point you're trying to say is that the fantasy itself can be as profound or more profound than doing anything in reality.
As hot, more hot. Yes.
Yeah. No, and I would agree with that. I think the imagination is a beautiful playground, and oftentimes, yes, people do feel guilty. And we've been taught from a lot of our religious scripts that our thoughts will also condemn us. So it's like this idea that, oh, if I'm having a passionate or erotic thought, then that I'm doing something wrong. But I usually like to point out, like, how many of us played as kids. With brothers, I played G.I. Joe a lot with them. And we killed each other a lot. Yeah. It was very dramatic. Yeah. There was these great death scenes, and then we'd get up and play it again, and it was fun. But nowhere in real reality did I want any harm to come to my brothers. Would I have ever wanted my brothers to die or anything like that? That would have been horrific, right? But in the play of it, we took this kind of violent theme, and it became playful and fun. And I think that's one of the things you talk about, is that one of the things that keeps kind of sexual aliveness or vitality is novelty or spiciness or newness or the taboo. So yeah, what do you have to say about all that?
I have a couple of thoughts on that. Like, yes, our fantasies are our friends. Even when we are threatened by them, I think we should reframe our fantasies and see them as being helpful and being friendly, because they're doing an important job. they're getting us aroused. And, I don't know about you, but like looking around at life and reading the newspaper, like I'm kind of overwhelmed. Like I'm not going to so easily just become aroused, and so I think our fantasies, and one of the reasons they are kind of extreme is because they really help us turn off our thinking brains. And become aroused. Now, what was the question again? I'm sorry, I just lost the thread on what we...
No, just that. I mean, just kind of your ideas about why is it that we need novelty and,
The second point I was going to make, though, is in a sex script, I think it's great to get a lot of novelty going in the beginning and as you're really cultivating arousal. But I think there is a certain point in the sex script, sort of, I'd say on the other side of the middle, headed towards really being aroused and headed towards orgasm, where we do kind of want to go into a kind of an autopilot, and we just want to, it's kind of like driving, like you're just going. You can be on the phone talking to somebody or listening to music, and you're still driving, you're still getting from A to B, and you just procedurally, you know how to do everything that you're supposed to do. And so I do think at a certain point, we do kind of need to go on a kind of autopilot. Novelty and new things are exciting and unpredictable, but they also really challenge us to think. And at a certain point, we want to stop thinking. So I think that there is this fine balance in terms of a kind of arousal that draws its energy from novelty and the taboo and unpredictability, and arousal that really just derives from procedures or ways of choreography that we really know very well.
Yeah, that's really good. I think this is one of the things I'm working with a lot for people, is to give themselves permission to think sexually, to think erotically, to give their partners permission outside of this, what I call ownership model, which is a lot of times like you're only allowed to have the sexual thoughts and ideas that make me comfortable. So therefore, like, I own your sexuality, and I'm always like, oh no, we don't, we own our own sexuality, and then hopefully we're going to share our sexuality with another person. But yes, I kind of love all of this. You did talk about like the reasons why we have sex, and you talked about recreational, you talked about relational, then you kind of came up with a term that's kind of mixes, both. So anyway, just talk about the different reasons.
Yeah, I think, I think that, if you look at the history of sexology, which really began in the Victorian era, sex was mainly supposed to be procreative, and anything else that wasn't purely procreative was sinful in some ways. And I think, as time went on, we sort of evolved into a little more of a relational view of sex, where most of the time it's not procreative, it's affiliative, or it's connecting, or it's relational. And so I think that's the place where a lot of us really live in terms of sexuality. But then I think that there's also the recreational. There's sex for the sake of sex. There's pleasure for the sake of pleasure, and it doesn't have to be necessarily connected into the relational. And when people masturbate, they're often in the recreational. They're allowing themselves to fantasize and watch or listen to something. They're allowing themselves to pull out all sorts of sex toys, and they're really playing with themselves. And I think very often single people, when you're sort of in maybe a little more of a casual sex phase or a sexual exploration phase, you're not thinking about settling down necessarily. You allow yourself to be a little lighter and to be a little more recreational about sex, and to try out things that might be new and taboo. And I think what happens for most couples is we kind of get stuck in the relational and we lose the recreational. And so I'm about the rec-relational. Did I get all that right? Rec-relational sex, kind of combining the two, I think is the best sex. When you have like the emotional safety of a secure attachment, and you feel like you can really be vulnerable with someone, and then that vulnerability allows you to really play and have fun, that's rec-relational sex.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's great. I talk often about like all the reasons why we have sex. And sometimes these reasons become scripts too, like, oh, well, we're using it badly because it's a coping mechanism. I'm like, I think sex can be a great coping mechanism. I think it's a great way to cope with a lot of things.
Absolutely. I'm having sex because it's important to my partner. I'm having sex because it's important to my relationship. I'm having sex because I feel good. I'm having sex because then my partner's going to be really nice to me. I'm having sex because it's an escape. Plenty of reasons to have sex, all valid. We just want the sex to be consensual and pleasurable.
Yes, right. Yes, I love it. All right. So I think that, well, I guess I wanted to ask you what reaction you've gotten from this book so far. What's kind of been the feedback you've been getting? Are you, happy with I thought it was very well done as a sex therapist myself. I thought like, gosh, there's so many points in here that I'm consistently trying to get across, and it's just really well contained in a
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, but yeah, what's been kind of the reaction?
The book came out of like years and years of working with couples and really trying to allow people to work on their own sex scripts without having to necessarily see a sex therapist. And so I think I've been getting largely positive feedback from people who are gravitating very often to certain aspects of their sex script and are now finding that they have language to talk about it in ways that they didn't have language before. I'm also getting really nice feedback from therapists as well who are using it in their practices. I have a very for better or for worse, I have a very narratively structured sort of linear way of sort of thinking and simplifying the world, and I think I think that is sort of the spine of the book, and so I hope it just provides a kind of accessibility and ease in that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it was very kind of solution focused and driven, and gave a good scaffolding, which people can use, and then they can go deeper with a therapist if they want to from that point on. But I thought it was very useful. Plus, you shared a lot of anatomical information, a lot of like good just sex ed in regards to, like you're saying, like what types of pressure and touch and all those things can help with orgasms, female bodies.
I did try and bring in diverse case studies. Yeah,
you did with trans folks and LGBTQ folks and all kinds of things. So that was it was great. So what I guess the other question I ask before I end with people is, what am I not asking? What would you have liked to share that maybe I didn't ask you about?
The one thing I was thinking about as we were talking that I forgot to mention, which is going back to that erotic thread, is that sometimes more than the sex itself, what we want is to feel desired by our partners. We desire to be desired, and that includes women and men, and we show desire in different ways. But I remember I was once working with a couple, and I think it was the male partner. He said, we never have sex. We're just sort of in this sex rut. And she's like, well, what do you mean? We had sex like 3 times last week. And he said, yeah, right, we had sex, but I don't feel desired, is what he was really trying to say. So I think it's also really just important to work on how we access and express desire. And I'm more and more I am meeting young couples who are picking their life partners, but they're picking more like their best friends, or they're picking good companions more than they're picking romantic partners to whom they're sexually attracted. And I think that that's a big mistake. I think that sexual attraction and sexual chemistry are really important and really become a glue in a relationship. And I do not believe that sexual energy is something that necessarily diminishes over time. So why bother caring about it? I think it's something that when you begin with that kind of a bang and that kind of energy and attraction, I think it really has like an afterglow that can cast itself across the entire relationship. So I think having that and being able to access that desire and express it is really important.
Wow, that is so interesting that that's what you're noticing amongst the younger generations. This is a problem we have coming out of kind of religious spaces, is that oftentimes we were told to prioritize relationships based on everything you just said, friendship and respect, and whether or not they're, close to God, and, you have the same values, but nobody ever really taught us, hey, and by the way, you should probably be hot for this person too. That's not a message we really got like in our Sunday school lessons, So I have seen this issue come up a lot, where a lot of people, I think, married their best friend. And I've had even people tell me I actually avoided that person that I was really kind of lusting after, because I thought, ooh, we're going to get in trouble, by maybe having premarital sex or whatever. So I steered more over here to my friend. But then 20 years later, they're in my office, and one, if not both of them, are struggling with this kind of sexual chemistry. Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a big debate within our field, the extent to which desire can really be created, even if it wasn't there in the first place. And certainly couples come to work with us often to find desire, to refine it, or to cultivate it. But I think that there is something to really be said just for the core heat and attraction that draws you to someone. And for anybody who thinks you can't have it all in a partner, you can't have lust and love, they're absolutely mistaken.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think we've been given a lot of misinformation, unfortunately. I've always said it's easier to stoke a fire that once had kindling, versus kind of starting something from the get-go. So no, I appreciate you prioritizing that statement, that I think that's important. Unless you're asexual or gray sexual and those things don't matter and your companion doesn't care. But I think that's not the majority of the population either. So, yeah. All right. Well, I can't thank you enough for your time that you're spending here helping us and my audience and things that I think are just so pivotally important. Again, Ian Kerner is the author of So Tell Me About the Last Time You Had Sex. I highly recommend this book be on your bookshelves and to be talking about it, especially if you're in partnered relationships. But even like you said, if you're planning to be partnered at some point or to have sexual activity, I think it's super useful.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. Know your know what you want your sex script to be.
Yeah, right.
What you want it to include.
Yeah.
And when you want those activities. Anyway.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And it's both an individual and a coupled process. So thank you so much for your time, and we will hopefully connect some other time. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Naho tishki say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. mystery etched on her canyon walls. Alongside Earth's mysteries, some places should be left alone. Nahotish kishaden alone. So we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Nahotish shade so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.